indigenous people to help their own communities can be challenging if they're facing such negative outcomes here. So we are all treaty people in Canada. First Nations people sign treaties with the past governments of Canada. We all have obligations to honor the treaties and work together to build a Canada that benefits all the people who live here. I think this is where we start taking notes again for slides 16 and 17. We already kind of went over this. Also, there's a photo of all those bison skulls, so I'm assuming most of those bison weren't harvested for meat. Likely they were harvested for their furs. It's not clear to me or obvious to me what they kind of did with the meat and bodies. It's possible that they just, I've heard some stories from American history that, they just kind of like rode out to the plains and just shot bison and just left them there. And part of that might have been a process just to decimate the food source for many indigenous peoples, to starve them out, to then maybe force them to sign treaties or agreements. And I do think it's important to keep in mind that the history and relationship between the Canadian government, indigenous peoples, and the American government, their indigenous peoples, is very different. In America, as far as I'm aware, is an incredibly violent history. And the existence of, let's say, indigenous groups in America is a lot lesser than it is in Canada, I would say. Okay, but some of the reasons for these treaties: so building a railway to connect to BC, open up the West for immigration, for settlement. Okay, so like it says there, indigenous people in Canada, the Canadian government, they wanted to avoid war and conflict. The American people, the American government was, actively fighting wars and committing war crimes and whatnot. Many First Nations groups, in their desire to plan ahead, were thinking, well, how do we protect the future generations? What do we do what's best for, our great-grandchildren? Okay. Many people in the American and many indigenous people living in what is now America, they banded together, they tried fighting back. They had many resistances. There was a lot of massacres, a lot of slaughters. So both these countries have very different relationships with indigenous peoples and very different outcomes. Unfortunately, both countries have very negative outcomes for indigenous peoples. There's, a legacy of historical globalization, as we discussed in grade 10s. In the grade 10 curriculum. Here's another slide you're going to want to take notes on. So some perspectives. Big difference between First Nations cultures and kind of European Canadian culture. In European culture, they were a written society, so they would write things down. At least, by this time, because I know there's a lot of oral traditions in Greek history, but First Nation societies, from my understanding, many of them, if any of them, didn't have a written language, and so they just kept oral traditions. So they had to have people who would likely memorize or remember what the agreements were and recount those stories and traditions. Okay. First Nations may have held this view that land is not something you own, it's just something you're a part of, that you're nestled within or embedded into. Whereas for European nations, for their societies, definitely by the 1700s, even prior to that, there was definitely this idea of ownership of not just things but land as well. And to be honest, it's not clear to me if all First Nations held this view. Again, when you think of First Nations, it's important to not cherry pick particular groups. So if you were to look at First Nations groups all across North and South America, particularly in South America, I don't know if you kids remember what you learned last year about the Mayans and whatnot. Like they definitely settled in certain areas. They established that was their territory. Many indigenous groups in North America as well, you know, they had their own territories and they would violently fight one another if they crossed over, right? The Europeans, it's not clear to me if they exploited this or simply observed that, okay, there's clearly a conflict among certain groups here. Well, we can use this group to help us, and we'll fight against their enemy and they'll fight against our enemy, you know, so. You know, it's not clear to me if all indigenous groups in Canada thought that land wasn't something you could own. Some of them might have disagreed, some of them might have been more stationary. Okay. Okay, and that wraps that up.